The alien warriors had never encountered anything like it before. A simple human, standing in the middle of a battlefield, had just done the impossible. They watched in stunned silence as the grenade they had launched, a high-speed, self-targeting explosive, was caught mid-air by the very species they had underestimated. And then, with a flick of his wrist, the human tossed it right back. Moments earlier, the battlefield had been filled with chaos. Smoke curled through the air, laser fire crisscrossed the sky, and the deep hum of war machines echoed across the valley. The invaders, an elite force known as the Zeldar, had stormed Earth with the kind of overwhelming power that had crushed civilizations before. They were larger, faster, and armed with technology that should have made resistance futile. But humans were different. Captain Daniel Hayes had been through enough battles to know when a fight was hopeless. But that didn't mean he was about to roll over and die. He and his squad had been holding the line for hours, taking cover behind the wreckage of a fallen transport. They were outgunned, exhausted, and running low on ammo. And then came the grenade. It wasn't just any grenade. It was a Zeldar plasma detonator, capable of vaporizing anything within a 10-meter radius. It flew through the air, humming with lethal energy, heading straight for Daniel and his team. Any sane person would have scrambled for cover. But Daniel's body moved before his mind could catch up. He reached out, hands wrapping around the metallic sphere in one fluid motion. The grenade vibrated in his grip, its deadly core pulsing with energy. He had maybe 2 seconds before it exploded. The Zeldar soldiers, positioned on the ridge, had already turned away, assuming their weapon had done its job. They didn't expect what happened next. With the kind of instinct that only came from years of playing fastball in the dusty streets of his hometown, Daniel hurled the grenade back with perfect accuracy. It arced through the air, slicing through the smoke, and landed right in the middle of the Zeldar formation. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a blinding explosion. The ground trembled as the grenade detonated, sending shockwaves through the alien ranks. The Zeldar warriors stumbled backward, their glowing eyes widening in disbelief. This was not how the battle was supposed to go. They had fought countless species before, civilizations that had fallen in days, some in mere hours. None had done this. From their vantage point, their commander, Varesh, watched in stunned silence. His species prided itself on war. Every encounter was calculated, every victory inevitable. Yet here, on this backwater planet, a mere human had just turned their own weapon against them. He narrowed his eyes, studying the figure below. The human stood tall, chest rising and falling with steady breaths, as if this was just another day in his strange, chaotic life. Behind him, his squad peeked over their cover, just as shocked as the aliens. For the first time in his career, Varesh felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Daniel, however, had no time to savor the moment. He knew what was coming. The Zeldar didn't take humiliation lightly. They would retaliate, and when they did, it wouldn't be with just a single grenade. A sharp buzz filled the air. More energy signatures flared to life. Daniel glanced up and saw it, the next wave of incoming fire. Dozens of plasma bolts streaking toward them. "Move!" he shouted, diving for cover. His team followed, barely dodging the incoming blasts. But something was different now. The aliens hesitated, their attacks slower, less precise. Daniel could see it. They were afraid. And for the first time in the history of the Zeldar, the hunters had just become the hunted. The battlefield was still smoldering from the explosion, but Daniel had no time to celebrate. His pulse pounded as he crouched behind a half-destroyed transport, breathing in the sharp scent of burning metal and scorched earth. His squad was alive, shaken but unharmed for now. But the Zeldar wouldn't let this stand. Sergeant Blake, his second-in-command, slid in beside him, eyes wide. "Did you seriously just throw that thing back at them?" Daniel exhaled, shaking out the tension in his hands. "I guess I did." Corporal Ruiz let out a low whistle. "Damn. You just made history, Captain." But there was no time for jokes. The aliens were regrouping, their formations shifting as new orders crackled through their comms. Daniel knew what was happening. They weren't just attacking anymore. They were watching, studying. Across the field, the Zeldar commander, Varesh, stood rigid, his claws flexing at his sides. He had faced resistance before, but this was different. The humans were supposed to be weak, undisciplined, too fragile to stand against their might. And yet, one of them had just done something no species had ever dared. He had taken their weapon, one of their most precise instruments of destruction, and turned it against them. Varesh's mind raced. He had read the intelligence reports. Humans were clever, yes, resourceful in their desperation. But this one was something else. His reaction speed, his precision, it was unnatural. Almost as if he had trained for this moment his entire life. And yet, his face wasn't one of arrogance or defiance. He didn't look like a warrior reveling in victory. He looked calm, calculated. That disturbed Varesh more than he cared to admit. Daniel stole a glance over the wreckage, scanning the enemy lines. He could see the hesitation in their ranks. Before, they had attacked without mercy, an unstoppable force moving forward like a tidal wave. Now they hesitated. They were reassessing the situation, recalibrating their approach. That was an opening. A small one, but it was there. He turned to Blake. They weren't expecting that. We just bought ourselves a little time. Blake smirked. You planning to catch another grenade? Not if I can help it. But Daniel wasn't the only one who noticed the shift. High above the battlefield, hidden among the jagged cliffs that overlooked the valley, another set of eyes was watching. A figure stood motionless, cloaked in shadow, observing the chaos below with quiet interest. The human had done something remarkable. Something dangerous. A low voice crackled through a communicator. Report. The figure hesitated for a moment before responding. The humans are not as weak as we thought. Silence followed. Then a simple reply. Continue observation. Back on the ground, Daniel was already moving. The momentary lull wouldn't last long. He motioned for his team to stay low as they crept along the shattered landscape, weaving through the wreckage of fallen ships and abandoned supply crates. They needed a plan, and fast. Ruiz adjusted his earpiece. Command's gone dark. We're on our own. Daniel clenched his jaw. That wasn't good. If higher-ups had cut communication, it meant one of two things. Either they were too busy dealing with the invasion elsewhere, or they had already assumed his team was dead. Neither option inspired much confidence. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the field, Varesh was giving orders. His warriors were repositioning, spreading out in a formation Daniel had seen before. They were closing the gaps, cutting off any possible escape routes. They're boxing us in, Blake muttered. Daniel's grip tightened around his rifle. Yeah, and they're being careful about it. The Zeldar weren't taking chances anymore. That meant one thing. Daniel had just changed the rules of engagement. But what neither side knew was that something else was coming. Something neither human nor alien had accounted for. And it was watching, waiting, and soon it would make its move. The air was thick with tension. Every breath Daniel took felt heavier, like the battlefield itself was pressing down on him. He could feel the shift in the Zeldar's strategy. Before, they had attacked with sheer force, expecting humans to crumble beneath them. Now they were being methodical, trying to box him and his team in without making the same mistake twice. Daniel glanced at Blake and Ruiz. They saw it too. The aliens weren't rushing in anymore. They were waiting, observing, adapting. That was a problem. A flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the Zeldar warriors adjusting the setting on a strange device strapped to their arm. A deep hum vibrated through the air, barely audible but enough to make Daniel's skin prickle. Something's coming, he muttered. Blake frowned. What kind of something? Daniel wasn't sure, but the way the aliens were repositioning made his stomach twist. This wasn't just about eliminating a threat anymore. They wanted him alive, and that terrified him more than any weapon they could fire. A sharp crack split the air. A blue pulse of energy rippled outward from the Zeldar lines. It wasn't an attack, it was something else. A signal. Before Daniel could react, the ground beneath him trembled. Dust kicked up around his boots, and a strange static charge made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Then he heard it, a low, unnatural hum, deep and resonant, vibrating in his bones. Ruiz's eyes widened. What the hell is that? A shimmer appeared in the air, just beyond the wreckage. For a moment, it looked like heat distortion, the kind you'd see on a hot road in the middle of summer. But then it moved, deliberate, controlled. Something was coming through. Daniel raised his weapon, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. But he held his ground. If this was what the Zeldar had been waiting for, he needed to know what it was. The air thickened, bending like liquid, and then, suddenly, it solidified. A figure stepped through the distortion. It wasn't Zeldar. It wasn't human. It was something else. Tall and thin, its body was covered in sleek, segmented armor that shimmered like molten metal. Its head was smooth, featureless, except for a single glowing slit where eyes should have been. It moved with eerie precision, like it wasn't entirely bound by the same physics as everything else. Daniel felt his stomach drop. The Zeldar commander, Varesh, let out a sharp clicking sound, something between a command and a greeting. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if processing the information, then turned toward Daniel. A wave of cold passed through him, though he wasn't sure why. Blake whispered, "That's not Zeldar tech." Daniel didn't respond. He was too focused on the way the figure moved, how it seemed to exist just slightly out of sync with everything else. Even the dust in the air didn't settle naturally around it. Varesh took a step forward, claws flexing. He pointed at Daniel, then spoke in his guttural, alien tongue. The armored figure remained silent for a moment. Then, without warning, it moved. 1 second, it was standing still. The next, it was in front of Daniel. He barely had time to react. His rifle was up in an instant, finger tightening on the trigger, but the figure didn't attack. It just stood there, towering over him, its presence impossibly heavy. Then it did something Daniel hadn't expected. It reached out. Not in a strike. Not in a grab. A test. It was waiting. Watching. Daniel's heart pounded. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. But something deeper, something instinctual, made him hesitate. The Zeldar weren't the only ones studying him. This thing, whatever it was, wanted to see what he would do. And Daniel wasn't sure if he wanted to find out why. Daniel didn't move. His breathing was steady, controlled, but inside his mind was racing. The armored figure stood inches away, unmoving, waiting. It was testing him, studying him, and every second that passed made the air feel heavier. The Zeldar, usually so ruthless, remained still as well. They weren't just allowing this, they were expecting something. Blake's grip tightened on his rifle. "Captain?" Daniel barely heard him. His focus was locked on the figure in front of him, trying to read whatever it was thinking. He wasn't sure if it even thought like a human or an alien. Its glowing slit of an eye pulsed faintly, shifting colors in slow waves. Was it communicating? Measuring his response? Then, without warning, the figure reached out further, faster than Daniel could track. He flinched, jerking back on instinct, but the thing didn't attack. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, hovered just in front of his chest. It was almost inviting. Daniel's fingers twitched near his weapon. He could feel Blake and Ruiz tense beside him, their nerves stretched thin. One wrong move could set off something none of them were prepared for. A sharp sound came from the Zeldar ranks. Varesh. The alien commander took a step forward, his posture tense. His species was ruthless, built for war, but there was something else in his stance. Something Daniel had never seen from the Zeldar before. Unease. The figure turned slightly at the sound, but it didn't pull back. If anything, its presence seemed to grow heavier, the air around it bending slightly like heat off a furnace. Daniel's gut twisted. This wasn't just a show of power. It was a warning. Whatever this thing was, the Zeldar feared it. Maybe not openly, but enough to act cautiously. Enough to hesitate. And that alone sent a shiver through Daniel's spine. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, then did something reckless. He reached out. Blake inhaled sharply. Ruiz muttered something under his breath. Daniel's fingers barely grazed the figure's outstretched hand when a pulse. Not a physical force, but something deeper, like an electrical charge buzzing through his skin, racing up his arm. For a split second, the world around him seemed to slow. Colors sharpened, sounds dulled, and then pain. It wasn't like being hit or burned. It was deeper, like something pressing into his mind, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. Flashes of something not his own flickered behind his eyes. Planets he had never seen, battles fought in places beyond human understanding. A war older than anything Earth had known. And then he saw it. A shape, massive and distant, yet somehow near. A void where light should be, moving across the stars like a shadow. It wasn't the Zeldar. It wasn't anything he had ever imagined. And it was coming. The connection broke. Daniel staggered back, gasping. The figure withdrew its hand, tilting its head slightly, as if confirming something. Daniel's heart pounded. He looked at Varesh. The Zeldar commander wasn't watching him. He was watching the figure. And for the first time, Daniel understood. The Zeldar weren't here to conquer Earth. They were running. And whatever they were running from had just noticed humanity. Daniel's breath was ragged, his mind still reeling from whatever just happened. The visions, the cold vastness of space, the thing moving through it, it wasn't just an image. It had felt real, too real. His skin still tingled where the armored figure had touched him, as if something had burrowed beneath the surface. He forced himself to stay steady, even as a new realization clawed at the edges of his thoughts. The Zeldar weren't invaders. They were refugees, and humanity had just stepped into something far bigger than a war for survival. Varesh's mandibles twitched, his eyes locked on the figure as if waiting for something. Daniel recognized that look. It wasn't just fear, it was calculation. The Zeldar commander had been prepared to fight humans, to crush them if necessary. But this was something he hadn't accounted for. Daniel turned back to the figure, its glowing slit of an eye still shifting, analyzing him. Then it did something strange. It took a step back, not retreating, watching, waiting. Ruiz's voice was tight. "Captain, what the hell just happened?" Daniel swallowed, trying to find the words, but before he could speak, the ground trembled. A deep, distant vibration, different from the pulse before. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was something else. Something bigger. Varesh snapped toward his warriors and barked a command. The Zeldar immediately moved, their weapons no longer trained on the humans but instead raised toward the sky. Daniel followed their gaze. His stomach dropped. A rift was opening. Not like the distortion the armored figure had stepped through. This was different. The air above them split apart, jagged and violent, as if something was tearing through reality itself. A swirling void of darkness yawned open, stretching wider, crackling with an eerie, unnatural energy. Then something came through. Not a ship. Not an army. A presence. Daniel couldn't see it, not fully, but he felt it. A weight, pressing against the world, as if the very laws of physics strained under its arrival. The sky dimmed, as if the light itself was being devoured. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but he was frozen. The armored figure turned its head toward the rift. It remained silent, unmoving, but something in its posture changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. Varesh let out a low growl, then turned to Daniel. For the first time, his voice wasn't a threat. It was a warning. "You do not understand what you have done." Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. "Then explain it." Varesh's eyes flicked to the figure, then back to the rift. More of the Zeldar were pulling back now, moving as if preparing for something worse than battle. The commander's voice was sharper now, urgent. "We did not come to take your world. We came to escape. But now it has seen you." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "What is it?" Varesh hesitated. Then, his voice dropped into something almost reverent. "The end of all things." The moment the words left his mouth, the rift pulsed. A wave of force rippled outward, sending debris flying. The air turned heavy, thick with something unseen yet undeniably present. And then, deep from within the void, something moved. Not just one thing. Many. Shadows slithering through the darkness, vast and unknowable. No ships, no warriors, just forms. Twisting. Growing. Reaching. Daniel's grip tightened around his weapon. For the first time in this war, the enemy wasn't the Zeldar. It was something far worse. The sky churned with darkness as the things within the rift twisted and shifted, their forms too massive, too unnatural to fully comprehend. A low, bone-deep hum resonated through the air, rattling Daniel's skull and sending waves of unease through his body. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't just entering this world. They were consuming it. Varesh barked another command, and the Zeldar moved fast, forming a perimeter, their weapons glowing with strange energy. But even they looked hesitant. Their advanced technology, their brutal efficiency, it was nothing compared to this. They weren't warriors now. They were survivors trying to escape something inevitable. Daniel gritted his teeth and turned to the armored figure. You knew this was coming. The figure didn't answer, but Daniel didn't need words to understand. It had been waiting, watching, measuring humanity's response. And now the moment had arrived. One of the shadows from the rift lashed outward, stretching impossibly far, almost like liquid, but moving with purpose. It struck a Zeldar soldier before anyone could react. There was no scream, no struggle, just a flicker of distortion, and then the warrior was gone. Not dead. Erased. As if he had never existed at all. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't a fight. It was an extinction event. Ruiz stepped back, his hands shaking. Captain, we don't have weapons for this. Blake's voice was grim. Nobody does. Varesh spun to Daniel, his alien eyes burning with urgency. Your world is not ready. You must leave. Daniel clenched his fists. That's not an option. More of the shadows unfurled, stretching, reaching. The Zeldar opened fire, their energy blasts cutting through the air, but it was like shooting light into a black hole. Nothing stopped the darkness. It only grew. The armored figure finally moved. It stepped forward, its glowing slit of an eye narrowing. Then it raised one hand. A pulse of energy exploded outward, different from anything before. Not a weapon, a command. And the shadows hesitated. Daniel's breath caught. The things in the rift, they recognized this being. Not as an enemy, not as prey, as something else. The realization sent a chill through him. The figure hadn't been observing them out of curiosity. It had been deciding, choosing. Varesh saw it too. His mandibles twitched, his voice a whisper. You are not one of us. The figure finally spoke. A voice layered and deep, neither human nor alien. I was. The words struck like a hammer. Daniel barely had time to process them before the figure turned toward him, its eye pulsing with unreadable emotion. This is not your war. Daniel's jaw clenched. It is now. The figure studied him for a long moment. Then, with an eerie fluidity, it raised both hands. The energy around it surged, and suddenly, the rift began to collapse. The creatures inside twisted and thrashed, recoiling as if being pulled back. The darkness trembled, struggling against the force drawing it in. Varesh took a step back, his expression unreadable. You would sacrifice yourself? The figure didn't answer. But Daniel understood. It wasn't saving them. It was containing them. The void shrank, folding in on itself. The pressure in the air grew unbearable, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought reality itself might snap. Then, silence. The rift was gone. The sky was still. And so was the figure. It remained standing, its form flickering slightly, as if it wasn't fully there anymore. Then slowly, it turned its head toward Daniel one last time. Prepare. And then it vanished. The battlefield was quiet. The Zeldar lowered their weapons. The threat was over. But the war had only just begun. The battlefield felt wrong in its stillness. The sky, once torn apart by the rift, was eerily quiet. The darkness was gone, but its presence still lingered, an echo of something too vast to fully comprehend. Daniel let out a slow breath, his hands still shaking. The figure was gone. The creatures had been pushed back. But the weight of what had just happened remained heavy in his chest. Ruiz exhaled sharply. Did we just survive that? Blake gave a small, humorless laugh. Survive? We didn't even fight. Daniel didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the Zeldar, who stood in tense silence. Their posture had changed. They weren't enemies anymore. Not exactly. They had come expecting conquest. Instead, they had witnessed something older, something greater than either species. Varesh stepped forward, his expression unreadable. It will return. Daniel nodded. He knew that much already. Whatever the figure had done, it wasn't permanent. It had delayed the inevitable. Varesh studied him, his sharp eyes narrowing. You understand now, don't you? This was never about us. Daniel clenched his fists. No, it was about something much worse. For the first time, Varesh looked uncertain. The Zeldar had always carried themselves with ruthless confidence. But now, there was something else in the commander's expression. A hesitation. A question he didn't want to ask but had no choice but to face. What will you do, human? Daniel took a slow breath, letting the gravity of that question settle. He wasn't just answering for himself. He was answering for humanity. We prepare. Varesh studied him for a long moment. Then, to Daniel's surprise, the Zeldar commander gave the smallest nod. Not of agreement, but of understanding. Without another word, Varesh turned and signaled to his warriors. The Zeldar moved with precision, regrouping, preparing to leave. They had come expecting to fight a war. Now they were walking away from one far greater than they had imagined. Ruiz stepped closer to Daniel, his voice low. You really trust them to just leave? Daniel watched as the Zeldar warships began to rise, their engines humming. I don't trust them, but they're not our biggest problem anymore. Blake let out a breath. And what is? Daniel looked up at the sky, at the stars beyond it, at the vast unknown that now felt just a little smaller, a little closer. The next time that rift opens, he said quietly, we won't have a choice. The realization settled over all of them like a weight. The battle was over, but nothing felt like a victory. Humanity had been spared, but only because something else had intervened. And that something was gone now. Daniel turned back to his team. They were exhausted, shaken, but they were alive. And as long as they were alive, they could fight. He straightened his shoulders. We tell Earth what happened. We prepare, we build, we find out everything we can about whatever's out there. Because next time we won't be lucky. Ruiz nodded slowly. Blake sighed but nodded too. They understood. The Zeldar ships vanished into the sky, leaving only silence in their wake. The battlefield was empty now. Nothing left but ruins and memories of something far greater than any of them. Daniel looked at the spot where the armored figure had stood. Its last words echoed in his mind. Prepare. He had no idea how. But he knew one thing for certain. The war hadn't ended. It had only just begun.